In this video, I'm going to share with you the art and life of William Blake, the painter, poet, renowned madman, and flat earther. Art review. Recently in the comments, someone recommended I check out the work of William Blake. Now, I was familiar with William Blake's paintings, but I didn't know much about his life, so I began my research. Quickly, I was hooked. Some people claimed he was a madman. Others claimed he was a spiritual visionary. He created his own mythology, and today he has a cult following. What was the story behind this man? Is he truly insane, or is he an artistic genius guiding people to greater enlightenment? I decided to dive deeper. William Blake was born in London in 1757. He was raised Christian, and throughout his adolescence he avidly read books, notably the Greek myths and the Bible. At 4, Blake claimed that he saw the face of God in a window. At 9, while walking through the countryside, he saw a tree full of angels. Visions that were predominantly biblical in nature would persist across his whole life. His parents perceived him as sensitive, so his mother homeschooled him until eventually sending him off to drawing school. While at drawing school, he took up poetry, which he would continue throughout his life. Soon he got a job apprenticing for an engraver who sent him to copy images from Gothic churches. He claimed that while in Westminster Abbey he had more visions. He saw Christ with his apostles in a great procession of monks and priests and heard their chants. After 7 years of apprenticeship, he emerged as a professional engraver. From there, he became a student at the Royal Academy, but he dropped out feeling that his imagination was being weakened by academia and because his teachers weren't interested in his art. Around 1784, his first collection of poems, Poetical Sketches, was printed. He continued through his life making brilliant works, but William Blake's most iconic works were his prophetic works. His prophetic works laid out a mythology of his own creation. This man created an entire mythology? Honestly, I didn't know exactly what to feel about this initially. I've always believed that the supreme social use of art is to strengthen the cultural fabric of a society. This typically means bringing to life what's already there, the philosophies, mythos, stories, and artistic symbols that are already central to a society's culture. Then adding value to them if you can, progressing the ideas that shape and give us further knowledge of our realities. William Blake did this, and he did this better than most. This concept of what an artist's social purpose is implies the existence of another caliber of artists who dare to create their own mythology from the ground up. William Blake was one of these artists. He wrote and painted an entire mythology. He brought to life an entire framework for understanding our realities. I think that's amazing. William Blake's mythology is spread across his so-called prophetic works and paintings, expressing his spiritual, psychological, and philosophical ideas. The most famous of these works were Milton, Jerusalem, and the Four Zoas. His mythos follows the fall of Albion, the primeval man. Albion's mind was in balance and he had divine vision, but he was cut off from it. As a result, Albion fell into the sleep of death. This sorry state is the material world that we are in now. But Albion will awaken again, and all will be seen by divine vision. Blake divides Albion's mind into 4 divisions called the Four Zoas. Each part of his mind was personified. There was Tharmas, who represents instinct and strength; Urizen, who represents conventional reason and law; Luva, who represents love and passion; and Orthuna, or Los, who represents inspiration and imagination. One of Blake's key messages is that modern man views the world in a Urizen way. Urizen is the conscious observer who demands actuality out of potentialities, just like us mortal observers. Urizen thought not only that he created the world, but that his creation was all that there is. Humanity too thinks what is grasped through rational empiricism is all that there is, but there is more to reality than what can be perceived in this Urizen manner. There is a more complete way to view reality, a fourfold vision. Blake lays out 4 types of vision. There is single vision, which is rational empiricism; twofold vision, which is that of the imagination; threefold vision, which is a peaceful place where contraries are equally true; and fourfold vision, which is difficult to explain, but to quote him, he said, "To see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." Elsewhere he wrote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern." Blake seems to be saying that everything we are experiencing is a mental model of reality and not a complete picture. Some interpreters of Blake suggest he was even claiming that space and time are creations of the mind. He said, "All spaces larger than a globule of blood exist as creations in our mind. At this point, I was wading through more than I expected. This video was supposed to be about his art, yet I can't understand the man's prophetic works without knowing the depth of meaning behind them. So far, I've found these ideas fascinating. They remind me of older pre-Socratic, Eastern, and Hermetic philosophies. It would be ignorant to write it all off as nonsense. Mystic intuition has realized profound truths in the past. The idea that space and time are creations of the mind has some supporters in the physics community. The idea that you can understand reality from a higher vision, that you can grasp eternality, would likely resonate with a lot of psychonauts as a way to explain their experiences. So even though to most modern-minded individuals claims of visions and higher realities seem like complete nonsense, I continued reading with interest. He writes, "Trembling I sit day and night. My friends are astonished at me, yet they forgive my wanderings. I rest not from my great task to open the eternal worlds, to open the immortal eyes of man inward to the worlds of thought, and to eternity ever expanding in the bosom of God, the human imagination." From his book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, we get some of the clearest statements of his philosophies. Without contraries, there is no progression. Energy is eternal delight. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. Opposition is true friendship. Thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. God only acts and is in existing beings and men, for everything that lives is holy. Man has no body distinct from his soul. That called body is a portion of soul. A lot of his statements in his works are enigmatic, some even seem contradictory, so it's easy to understand why, even if he was a genius, he would be deemed a madman. He did not speak as clearly as I have portrayed his ideas. In fact, I'm not even sure those are 100% accurate portrayals of his ideas. I don't think anyone understands all of his work. Probably not even him. In digesting all of this, it's impossible not to take into consideration who he was to the people around him. To many people in his day, he was a complete madman. Regularly, he would talk about his relationship with the spirit realm and his various visions. He claimed to have been visited by some of history's greatest legends: Socrates, Milton, and of course, Jesus Christ. He even discussed his relationship with various angels. He once claimed his dead brother gave him a helpful idea for his work. When someone asked him about the divinity of Christ, Blake said, "He's the only God, and so am I, and so are you." There was a mixture of Christianity and mysticism that most would consider heretical. Another potential reason for his dismissal was that he was clearly greatly influenced by a man named Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg was a famous inventor and scientist who had a prolific career. He was a very irrational man, but at the age of 53, he began to have dreams of heaven and hell. The dreams became lucid liminal dreams, then visions, or at least some form of active imagination. Swedenborg wrote what he had learned across many books, but one specific book was titled Heaven and Hell. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by Blake, he satirizes Swedenborg's teaching, or at least some people think that's what he was doing. In the book, he speaks casually about discoursing with angels in a manner very similar to Swedenborg, in a book that disagrees with Swedenborg. But Blake also legitimately claimed to speak with angels, so others say he was being authentic. Swedenborg had his own four-vision framework, which was clearly an influence. However, where with Blake I find his mythology and ideas to be psychologically and philosophically fascinating, with Swedenborg I find him to be, well, a true madman. It isn't his claims of visions and conversations with angels that pushes me away, funny enough, but it's his absurd theological conviction. For Swedenborg, his insights fit into the Christian framework. They were assertions about heaven and hell as literal places and claims about the judgment already taking place. For Blake, his insights are beyond Christianity. Christianity fits into his worldview as a poetic, psychological, or spiritual projection. He seemed to believe that Jesus, for example, was a representation of the divine imagination itself, and that the Bible was a poetic genius that was evidence of a greater power that can only be understood outside the influence of Urizen. These are very different assertions. Swedenborg's claims require the acceptance of Christian theology as fact, which means I have to gauge whether or not his claims seem logical within this framework. In my opinion, and apparently the opinion of most, they do not. Blake's claims are entirely different. Both Blake and Swedenborg have large cult-like followings today, but the association between Swedenborg and Blake gives me further insight into why he was written off by many. So we have a glimpse into his ideas and his message, a critique of the cold Urizen way of perceiving reality and a callback to imagination. And we understand in part why he was considered a madman. Now, what do I think? Well, I think when we apply his central message and framework to certain seemingly outrageous claims, they begin to make more sense. For example, he famously claimed that the earth was flat at a time when society was well past that idea. Obviously, he was right. Wake up, sheeple. But I think what Blake was getting at was a callback to a phenomenological reality, where we aren't just more matter on a rock in an unfathomable... unfathomably large entropic universe. Maybe again it was a critique of the Urizen way of perceiving human reality, mathematically and devoid of passion. The flat earth reminds one of the particularity of our existence. He says, "The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing which stands in the way. As a man is, so he sees." Now maybe what I'm doing is that annoying pretentious thing where people try to force profound meanings into nonsense. I kind of felt that way as I was speaking, but there is something about his work that captivates me. It's surreal and difficult to write off as madness. The line between creative genius and madness is very blurry, so perhaps he was both, meaning there's plenty of creative genius in his work to seek to understand. One thing that fascinates me about William Blake is how casually everyone seems to understand him. I read comments like, "So true, imagination is so important." Meanwhile, I feel no shame in admitting that I have no idea exactly what divine imagination is. How am I supposed to review William Blake's art when I don't even understand one of his core messages? What exactly is divine imagination? Imagination to me is associated with fabrication, so even if we agree that reality as experienced is a fabrication, then how does more fabrication make it any more clear what true reality is? How does that get you closer to a fourfold vision? All the commentary I read simply goes along with the idea that divine imagination gives you a new capacity for sight, without addressing exactly what that means. Perhaps it means the extension of meaning beyond a mere rational recognition of what a thing is, like the tree. Perhaps it is the human ability to return to an enchanted world and thus a richer reality. It isn't a gateway to a hidden reality, but a realization that the mind is not a servant to perception. Rather, perception is a servant to the mind. Anything grasped through imagination is just as real as that which is grasped through perception. Once you've opened that door, reality becomes far more than what it once was in single-fold vision. Perhaps imagination means something more like active imagination, a psychological process that gives you insight into consciousness beyond the ego, meaning imagination is a tool for knowing reality, unknowable through single-fold vision. Perhaps through having a greater understanding of imagination, you can see through your Urizen fabrications rather than just creating new fabrications entirely. And on my mind could go with, different ideas of what William Blake's divine imagination is. So I have far from a complete understanding of William Blake's prophetic works, yet they still strike me as something psychologically relevant. The man, the myth, the legend, supreme leader Carl Jung wrote in a letter, "I find Blake a tantalizing study, since he has compiled a lot of half or undigested knowledge in his fantasies. According to my idea, they are an artistic production, rather than an authentic representation of unconscious processes." Blake is an artist and a thinker that many scholars dedicate their entire lives to studying, so I'll leave the elaboration of his ideas to them. In this series, my intention is not to be an educator, but rather to lead you along my journey in, just exploring different artists. So what about his artwork? In focusing on his prophetic works, we're ignoring the rest of his work. Some of his most famous projects were illustrations of, say, the story of Job or the Divine Comedy. William Blake is obviously a talented artist, but I think it is his subject matter that makes him a great artist. All of these stories say something about the human condition. There are certain stories that are massively influential in society today. Obviously, the story of Job and Dante's Inferno are some of those stories, and he brings them to life. He's certainly a great artist, and I gave him an 8.245 out of 10. Very cool. Although Blake never had much financial success, he gained a little bit of fame. When he finally kicked the bucket, his wife continued to sell his works, but claimed that William Blake's ghost visited her, and so she always consulted him before a transaction took place. After his wife died, all his belongings went to his longtime acquaintance, Friedrich Tatham, who under the influence of his conservative fundamentalist church, decided to burn all the manuscripts he deemed heretical. Now, given what we know about William Blake, that's probably a lot. The amount of works that were destroyed is unknown, but Blake told a friend before he died that he had written 20 tragedies as long as Macbeth, none of which survived. Another acquaintance burned works he deemed lacking in quality, and yet another acquaintance erased sexual imagery from a number of Blake's drawings. Despite this messy ending, he went on to become a legend today. and eventually he was adopted into the Romantic movement, even though in my opinion his work is far beyond that movement. Thus, our artist came to an end. If you have any other artist recommendations for me to check out, feel free to comment them down below. Like this video if you want to help out a small channel, and thank you guys for watching. Bye.